seekers. The original idea I had for this video was to make it a reaction to another online witch here on YouTube, about sort of the video that she made about the proliferation of labels that witches use on themselves and each other, especially since like the advent of TikTok. But technology gremlins kind of made that impossible. So instead, I watched her video, and now I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions on this. And I kind of prepared an outline so I can just sort of read off. So if I look like I'm reading off, that's why. And this, I understand like this topic has been sort of being debated back and forth for years now, but I decided what the heck, I'm going to give my 2 cents on it anyway, for what it's worth. So here goes. Pretty much I agreed with most of the points that this person made. Link to her channel below. I can't, her name escapes me right now. I'm so bad with names. But yeah, link to her video down below. And now for my views on it. So like anything else, there's upsides and downsides to these labels. They can be, shorthand for people who are already in the community, as sort of like a way to easily identify like what their practice is, sort of like their wheelhouse, their bailiwick, so to speak. I can see how these labels would be an easy way, an easy identifier, sort of like a way for people to like easily identify who they are to others, and also compare themselves to others and kind of contrast, like, I'm a kitchen witch, you're like a cosmic witch or a sea witch or whatever. So I can see how that would be sort of helpful, especially if you're like meeting new witches for the first time, or if you're like new into the practice and you just want like a sort of a small area to focus on. The terms and the labels that are widely used on social media might not necessarily ring a bell for like older witches necessarily, and it kind of creates like a language barrier, sort of like how like young people use slang and older people might not necessarily like even know what that slang is. So a bit of a kind of a gap in understanding, between like newer witches who are adept with social media versus older witches who kind of maybe don't go on social media that much, or who maybe are on like the older platforms like Facebook, for example, who might not have necessarily heard of a lot of these labels. So there's that. And on the one hand, for less experienced practitioners, people who are new to it, creating kind of sort of like a barrier for them to sort of focus their energy on can be helpful. It can create just like, okay, this is this little narrow area, that's my area of focus, at least for the time being, rather than sampling everything, rather than the witch kind of going around, it's kind of self-guided and sampling everything that's within sight and potentially feeling like overwhelmed by the amount of information. They can just focus on like one singular small area and become like more adept at that and almost like master that single area of study. On the other hand, that barrier can also sort of limit the scope of the knowledge that they have. Like, while a generalist can sort of pick and choose from different areas as far as what to focus on, and not really be at any loss for options as far as like what different practices they can do, a specialist, someone who like specializes only in one narrow area, they only have like the knowledge and skills in that one area, and they're much more limited. And like I said, they're much more limited as far as like what they know and like what they can do. So there's that. I would say it becomes kind of harder to like branch out into like other areas, because it's like that label almost becomes like wound up in your identity. It's kind of hard to kind of shed that unless you want to pick up a new identity. A lot of these labels also carry with them a bit of like expectations as far as like aesthetics, and this can be for good or for bad. A lot of these labels can be perceived as fun, but a lot of these labels and their associated aesthetics could also be perceived as tedious or even silly. New joiners might, on the one hand, feel like drawn to that specific area, like really, really, like a lot. Or they might decide like, okay, this is too tedious, this is too much to like keep track of. A new joiner might be dissuaded from joining the craft as a result. For those people, maybe a more grounded version of the witchcraft that's a little bit less fussy and less focused on adhering to a certain set of aesthetics might have made it more accessible. But then again, maybe not. The biggest problem I see with labels currently is when people, like even new people or even people who've been at it a while, like myself, get so hung up on the labels and the aesthetics associated with them that they start to lose sight of why they wanted to get into witchcraft in the first place. In the case of new witches, they might not ever feel truly connected with it because they might not have ever had that moment of internal reflection. I mean, I had that moment when I was a teenager because this was like before all the, the different social media platforms came into existence, like TikTok and YouTube and whatnot. I would say I was more free. I had more time available to just sit and think and self-reflect and really come up with my own conclusions about things. Whereas nowadays, I'm concerned by the amount of, especially with like iPad kids and teenagers of today who don't necessarily have that chance because they're facing like this near constant barrage of advertisements and products and endorsements that are constantly like shoved in their face whenever they play games or whenever they scroll through TikTok or whatever. If they're in my mind, like if they're constantly just like reading, scrolling through TikTok, they're not necessarily reflecting on the material that is being put in front of them. Aesthetics themselves are not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, even back in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a whole aesthetic, for witches at that time as well, influenced by the likes of Charmed, Practical Magic, even Sabrina the Teenage Witch, that TV show. So, and, that would naturally have influenced someone like me who's joining, and I freely admit to that. But getting back to the labels and how witches use them today, to me, whether the usefulness of these labels ultimately boils down to whether these labels create more understanding in the witchy community or whether they create more confusion. If they create more understanding, then I guess it's all for the good. If they create more confusion, it's not for the good and should be discarded. Me personally, I don't feel the need to use them, but for those who do, like, I'm not gonna fault you for that. If what you're accustomed to is kind of putting yourself like in a bubble ballywick, this is my wheelhouse, this is my ballywick, that's fine. Just if you're ready to grow beyond that, don't limit yourself. Don't think like that's all you can be. There is a wider world to witchcraft outside of that one singular ballywick, and it's all worth exploring. It's my thoughts and opinions on labels. As always, peace and blessings, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.